Starting. So welcome everyone, and thank you for attending. I'm Rohit Kalbag, VP of Product Marketing, and we also have Sean here, who's a technical sales engineer. Sean, you want to unmute and say hi to everyone?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Depends where you are. Glad to be here, and I'll talk to you all in a few minutes.
Thanks. So we have collaborated on this webinar, and we are going to cover topics around user and device provisioning and the use of device identity to verify connection attempts and to enforce policies based on device identity. So before we move on to the agenda, I want to mention that you can ask questions using the Zoom Q&A widget, and answered questions will appear in the answered tab. I will also try to handle some questions live as and when they come in. But if either Sean or I type in answers to your Q&A, they will show up in the answered tab and the thread will get started there. So here's our agenda. I'm going to do a quick introduction of CloudConnexa, as some of you may not be familiar with it. It won't be using any snazzy marketing presentations, just some basic slides there to reinforce some of the concepts and key terms so that you can follow along as the webinar proceeds. I will then cover device relationships with user groups, and access control, and the various ways to add users and devices to the service. We will cover some controls with respect to devices. And then finally, we will get to the meat of the matter and see how we can use device identity and user identity and allow only authorized devices to access the service. When I'm done with all the talking, Sean is going to take over and demonstrate all these concepts in action. So that's what we have planned for this webinar. Let's get into introduction of some of the terms and CloudConnexa. So what is CloudConnexa? You can think of CloudConnexa as a cloud-delivered service that creates a virtual private overlay network. And once this network is created, you can connect to it through any of our points of presence, which are 30 plus spread around the world. And we use a term called region for it. So these regions, again, are data centers where we host our kernel optimized, high speed, high performance servers. And these regions interconnect to each other via mesh topology. So there is always a direct route between any of these two POPs or regions. And they're all, so this direct route helps in increasing the throughput, reducing latency, basically increasing your performance. And we also have redundant links to and routes to other of our POPs because we use mesh topology, and that increases the redundancy of the service. So this full mesh connected network across our regions, we call it as the core network, our core network. So CloudConnexa service is multi-tenant. What that means is that the regions and the core network that I just mentioned, all of them and all the other elements of the platform are shared with all customers, and they are virtually isolated. So we do not spin up dedicated servers for each customer. Instead, from the get-go, we have used this multi-tenant architecture, which brings the cost of the service down and makes it economical for our customers to use it. And just like I mentioned, there are no dedicated servers being spun up. So as soon as you sign up to the service, a virtual overlay network, which we call the wide area private cloud, is immediately created. And during the sign-up process, you are asked to assign a cloud ID. So this cloud ID is a unique identifier that is used to identify your WPC that just got created. And you can use anything as your cloud ID as long as it's unique in our system. You will get kind of like a subdomain with your cloudid.openvpn.com. And then you can use this subdomain to access your administration portal. And later on, we will see how the devices can also access this WPC URL to get information needed for connections. So for this webinar, we can simplistically think about the CloudConnexa WPC as kind of a virtual distributed router and a powerful next-gen firewall out there in the cloud. And you can think of all these regions as kind of the virtual router ports or ports to connect to this virtual router. So now the question is, how do we connect users, servers, and networks to these ports? So for that, we use the OpenVPN protocol, and we create tunnels over the internet. And in order to create these tunnels, we need to have a client app installed on the device. So that's the app that sets up the tunnel. So the official client app is called OpenVPN Connect. It's available for Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android. And for Linux, we recommend using our open source OpenVPN 3 client. OpenVPN protocol is also compatible with some routers like Ubiquiti and firmware like OpenWRT and others. So they can also be used to connect to our POPs or regions. Now you'll notice that there are two kinds of clients here. One we have said is a client, whereas the other we say is a connector. So what is the difference? So we use the term connector to distinguish the connection, to distinguish this connection from a typical on-demand user connection. So the connection set up by the connector is unattended and always on. And it is meant to provide access to applications. So the connector is meant to make networks and applications part of the WPC, and clients here are connect to the WPC to consume the services made available by the connectors. And then, I talked about devices, users, user groups. All of them are relatable terms that I'm not going to cover here. Let's now look at host networks and applications. So these things are representations of an application server, a private network, and an TCP/IP service when you configure CloudConnexa. So an application server on which the connector is installed, and it is providing direct access to applications installed on that server. For example, the ftp.test.local and rdp.test.local, we call it as a host. Whereas in here, when it's providing access to a private network, it's represented as a network. And once a network is configured, a connector is configured, then the devices on that network get access to services made available on your WPC, as well as other users and hosts and devices can get access to applications that you run on the private network. For example, here we have got HR Web and Timesheet applications being run on this private network. And as you probably have understood, so, applications is basically configurations and representations of any TCP/IP service being run. You can also guard the applications by defining only access to only specific protocols and ports. And later on, you can use these applications to define access control. So that hopefully was a quick intro into some of the terms and concepts related to CloudConnexa. And here are three quick things that, rather four things that make our service kind of unique. So our service is targeted for small and medium businesses. These businesses don't generally have experts in networking and security on staff. So we have taken real effort to make this service very easy to use. And we provide 3 free connections when you sign up, and it's there for use. It does not expire. You don't need a credit card. So anyone can quickly get started with the service, check it out, realize the value, and then purchase number of connections that they need. Another unique feature of our service is we use application names for routing. So all these domain names that you saw, that's how you can also route between different connected networks. So if you have 3 private networks connected to the WPC, even if the IP address subnets of those 3 networks overlap, it's fine. You can still connect because you can give those 3 networks different names and those applications within them different domain names. So for example, one network could be, ftp.store1.local, and the other one, the same application on the other network could be ftp.store2.local. And both of them could have the same IP address, but still CloudConnexa will find the right network and deliver it to the right destination. So there is no IP routing, subnets, and all of that involved in configuring the routing here. So that's, again, goes to making it really easy to use. And we also have vertically integrated. So these security services that we have, it's intrusion detection, protection, and content filtering. These are kind of integrated and built into the servers that we are running into in our data centers. So not just connectivity, we also provide some value add security services making it an all-in-one solution and decreasing operational costs. And lastly, whereas some of the other solution providers would be charging per seat or per user or per device, we charge based on the number of simultaneous connections. So it's more as a pay only for what you use or pay as you use kind of model. So you can configure as many users as you want, as many devices as you want in the service. Let's say as long as only 3 connections are simultaneously active, then our free plan, which provides 3 free connections, is adequate. So it doesn't depend on the number of devices, but the number of simultaneous connections. All right, so let's now transition to understanding how users, user groups, and devices all come together and how they relate to access control. So here's a figure which tries to explain the relationships. So let's start with the box in the middle here, device, which is labeled as 3. So device, basically any computing device, be it smartphone or your laptop computers, they all have associated with it as their hardware identity, something called as universally unique identifier, UUID. So based on this UUID, you can definitely tell one device apart from the other. So that is what we refer to in our webinar here as device identity. So that's the UUID that's permanently associated with the device. Then, as I mentioned, the devices need to have a client in order to create the tunnel and connect to the service. So for the client to connect, it needs something called a connection profile. So connection profile is basically a text file which has information about, okay, which region does the connection need to be made to? What are some of the compression and encryption parameters, etc. And then it has digital certificates in there. So the connection is always mutually authenticated. So the device authenticates the CloudConnexa server, the CloudConnexa server authenticates the device. All of that is done via PKI and digital certificates. And of course, there is the linkage with the user. So from the device, we have the connection profile. From the connection profile, we get to, and the digital certificates, we get to know the user. And the user is part of a user group. And then we define access control and access policies based on user group. So even though I started with the device to show the linkages, when you think about ZTNA and access control and configuring all of these things, you first start with user group because that's closely related with access control. Then second, you think about, okay, now how do I provision users? How do I map them to the user group? And then next, it's about device. So which devices are associated with the user, and should I restrict the number of devices, and where should this device connect to, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why now what we are going to do is we are going to proceed in steps, start with user group, go to user, talk about the device, and then just touch very lightly on access groups and access control. So step one is user groups. So as user groups are directly associated with how you manage access control for users, you need to think about what are you going to base those user groups on? Will it be role-based? For example, an account manager will have different access to different applications than a software developer. So it can be role-based, it can be department-based. For IoT devices, maybe it's based on location or what kind of function those IoT devices are doing. So basically, you think about what kind of access controls you need, how can you categorize and those access controls, and then think about configuring and naming those user groups. Now, once you create the user groups, you have to think about some of the controls associated with these user groups and the users and devices that will belong to each user group. So first thing is you think about, okay, should I allow the users in this user groups or the devices in this user groups to connect to any of the 30 plus CloudConnexa regions? So if your business has some regulatory reasons, or you don't have your workforce distributed all over the world, it's just in America, you can restrict the number of locations that the users and devices can connect to. Then you think about these devices' access to internet service. So when they are connected to CloudConnexa, what should happen to their internet access? So for IoT or point of sale or dedicated single purpose devices, you may consider why do they need access to general internet services at all. So you may want to restrict internet access for them, which will block all access to internet applications and just allow access to the applications that have been configured in CloudConnexa. Or you can think about, okay, do I need to get the internet traffic from these devices, get all of their traffic into my WPC? Maybe I have UTM or a security stack in one of the data centers. I want to examine all the internet traffic, apply corporate policies, etc. So you can turn split tunneling off. Otherwise, if you want the internet traffic to go directly through the ISP, you can turn split tunneling on. Another thing which is important and depends on how strict you want to be about user authentication during connection. So for IoT devices or unattended operation, you can say that, hey, just trust the digital certificate. You don't need to ask for username, password, or authentication during connection. Or you might say that, no, every time this user or device connects, it needs to authenticate. Or there is a in-between solution in which you can allow an authentication to last for some time so that the user does not need to re-authenticate often. And then lastly, what should be the number of devices allowed per user? So as I said, the pricing is based on number of simultaneous connections. So let's say if you have 10 simultaneous connections, you want to allocate the possibility of using those connections fairly. And if you allow a user group and a user to have 20 devices, and then that user ends up consuming all the 10 connections, then no one else can use it till you upgrade your service. So you can say, okay, for this user group, that are outside contractors, I'm just going to allow them to configure or use one device per user. For management folks, I can let them use 3 devices per user. So that's another variable here that you can think about when you are configuring user groups. All right, I see a question. Okay, so there's a question here. Are there any plans to get SCIM integration with Okta to manage these user groups dynamically? So that's a good question. That's for folks that don't know, SCIM is kind of a companion to SAML, and it allows both the identity provider to push information to the service provider and the service provider to send any changes that happen in user group, etc., back to the identity provider. And it's a standard, so it will work not just with Okta, but it will work with anyone that is compliant to SCIM. So the answer is that it's in our roadmap for this year. So we are working on it. It's in the plans. So yes, there are plans. Okay, so going to step 2. So now that we have dealt with configuring user groups, let's think about users. So how can users be entered into the service? So this question, based on the question just asked, users can be provisioned automatically. So what does automatically mean? That means using SAML or LDAP, once you set that up, when users authenticate, the user is created automatically in CloudConnexa's directory. Or manually, that means that you can just go into the administration portal and configure users right there on CloudConnexa. Now, once a user is created, device can be provisioned automatically or again manually. So this is dependent on profile distribution. So I explained earlier about the configuration profile that's needed for the device. So if you set the profile distribution to be automatic, as soon as the user goes into the Connect client and imports a profile, they need to authenticate, they need to use that URL, the WPC URL that I mentioned earlier, and authenticate, choose the region they want to connect to. Immediately a profile is downloaded in there. And as soon as that profile is downloaded, a device is automatically created under that user. And once the user connects, then more information will be available in the CloudConnexa portal, information such as the device operating system and also the UUID of the device. Secondly, when you set the profile distribution mode to automatic, you are essentially giving control to the user, because the user can use any device and import the profile as long as the authentication goes through. the configuration profile is downloaded. So like I mentioned earlier, let's say you restrict the user to only allow one device. And let's say that device in which they have downloaded the profile and connected is now broken and they get a replacement. Then when they try to download the profile on the other device, it's not going to allow it because only one device is allowed. But because it's automatic mode, the user can go to the user portal, delete that broken device, and then download the profile, and automatically the new device will be created. So users can manage their devices through the portal. And now in manual mode, once you put the profile distribution in manual mode, that means the control is no longer in the hands of the user. Only the administrator can create devices and download the profile for those created devices, and then send that profile over to the user to install in to import in a device with the Connect client. So in manual mode, the user does not have much flexibility. If they log into the user portal, they don't see any devices, they cannot manage devices or anything like that. Okay, and another question here. After each slide, I'm going to look and see if there are any questions. So any plans to implement FIDO authentication, YubiKey, or other hardware token? So this question is related to the abilities of our Connect client. If I am not mistaken, the Connect client already supports keeping that certificate into a hardware token or YubiKey, but I'll get back to you. There might be certain versions on certain operating systems that support that, but it's definitely something that we are looking into, if not already support. So okay, now here's kind of like a complicated looking flowchart, but it's not really that complicated. It just shows you some of the options here for user provisioning. And so the first step, as we discussed, is user groups. Second, before you choose the type of authentication, and because authentication is related to user provisioning, you first need to decide how do you want to distribute the connection profile to users. If you want to distribute it manually, it is probably better that you use CloudConnexa for authentication. And you will do this manual distribution generally for devices that cannot be really authenticated by user authentication, things like IoT devices and the like. So you would use CloudConnexa, then you would use a username, and then, for example, if it's an IoT thing, you can use the username as a location, and for that user group, you can say each user has is allowed to have 100 devices or so, and then for each username, which is a location, you can then start adding devices, configuring devices here. And when you add users, email is not mandatory. So you can just, again, that's because of this path here in which you might want manual control and IoT devices, etc. So if you want the users to get email invitations, you can add email. Immediately they get an email with an invitation. The email invitation contains the Cloud ID to use with their Connect app, the username and a temporary password, and the steps to get the app. Now, if you don't want to distribute the connection profile manually, or you want to do it, but the only choice is to use SAML or LDAP, you go ahead with that. And you can also use the local authentication to for automatic distribution. And once you set up SAML or LDAP, you configure and map one of the directory attributes that get sent, or the SAML attributes that get sent over after authentication, to each of the user groups you have created. And then there is no invitation email which goes out, because the users are created after authentication, and they will authenticate only if you tell them how to do it. So you need to share the Cloud ID with your organization and provide them information on getting the Connect client and how to log in and import the connection profile here. All right, now let's talk about device identity verification and enforcement. So we are coming to the device part. We completed user group setup, the questions associated with that, provisioning of users. And now while you're setting up devices, you have to answer this question, how much flexibility do you want to give to the users? If you want to follow strict zero trust guidelines, and enforce that only authorized devices can connect to your service, or you want to be flexible and allow the user to get the connection profile as long as they authenticate. So in keeping with zero trust policies, you can set this configuration here called dive enforce. So when you set the enforce setting, all the devices must be provisioned by the administrator. So this is in a control setting in which the IT group is taking ownership of the devices, handing out corporate devices, or allowing only specific bring your own devices which have device management and antivirus and all the other things that security team requires installed, and only those devices can be used. So in scenarios like that, it makes sense enforcing device identity verification. So once you do that, once you associate a device or create a device under the user, that profile is locked to the device. So even if the profile, or even if the device is compromised, the profile cannot be, the same profile cannot be used in another device. And users can download the profile automatically, but again, it needs to match with the device that UUID that has been configured. So it doesn't mean that just because you are using the enforce mode, you have to manually hand out profiles. No, it can be done automatically. It's just that the UUID should match. And the users lose the privilege of creating and deleting devices from the user portal. Everything is controlled by the administrator, by the IT team. So once you set the dive to enforce mode, you add devices under each user with the UUID. And the UUID can be found from the devices, from corporate devices prior to sending them to user, because you can use command line tools or see the system information, and you can find the UUID. And then if there are some users that are using BYOD devices, or the devices have already been sent to them, a Connect client also has been enhanced to show the UUID. So the users can just provide you the UUID of the device they already have, so that you can add that device to the user configuration. And lastly, now that you have enforced dive for your CloudConnexa WPC, you can now go ahead, configure access controls, and now your access control will be will work based on the device identity as well as the user identity. So that's all my talking done. And now I give it over to Sean for a demo of the 3 steps.
Yeah, thanks, Rohit. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we're gonna go ahead and start. Okay, just want to make sure everybody can see the screen. Rohit, can you confirm that, please?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So this is our admin portal or admin user interface. I'm going to try to go through these steps that Rohit just explained very quickly, go over all the settings and get to device and identity and verification. And we do a couple of demo to show you the user experience. The very first thing I want to show you is the users, because Rohit talked about users, groups, and devices, and how to provision devices for each users. So if you expand users on the menu, you can see where you can create the users. I already have some users here, but if you click on create users, you can just type the username and all the information that you need. Once you create the user, then you can either add the devices here, or if you have your device identity verification set up to off or learn and enforce, then the very first time when the user logs in, this information gets populated automatically. We're going to see that in a second. Now, when it comes to the groups, obviously, self-explanatory, you can create the groups. As Rohit explained, you can select all regions, or you can select a number of regions, however it's necessary for your environment. And then as far as the Connect authentication, you can choose if you want to have users to authenticate every time or every 24 hours or not at all. One-time authentication, they can save their logins. And then as far as the internet access, you can choose a split tunnel on or off. So these are basically the 2 parts that you can create users and user groups, especially when we try to set up the access policies or access groups. We really need to have the group set up already so we can assign permissions to each group. Now, as you can see, we have a tab for devices. Now you can add the devices here for each user, or you can do it under users as I showed you in a minute ago. So if you click on create device, you can give a name to the device, and then here you can select what user is going to have device and then the UUID, which I'm going to show you in a second. Now, again, keep in mind, if your dive or device identity verification is set to off or learn and enforce, you don't really need to do this, because once the user logs in the very first time, this information gets populated. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about here very quickly, it is the profile distribution. Since Rohit talked about that, it's under, you can find that under settings and users. You can see the profile distribution is set up to automatic. If you want to change this value, we just click on edit, and then down here you can change it to manual. Again, keep in mind when it's set to automatic, basically user can manage their devices through the portal. I'm going to show you that in a second. An admin cannot download the profile and send it to user, because, for example, here, if I go to user right now, mine is set up to automatic. If I try to download the profile, let's say I'm going to try to select the region here, I'm going to get an error message that I can't download it. So basically, my if an admin want to download the profile and send it to user, they need to change the profile distribution to manual. Once they change it to manual, then at that time, only admins, they can create devices manually and download the profiles for the users to share. Now, once we set this to manual, then the user portal is not going to show the option of adding devices or showing any devices for the users. Now, this is the part of the profile distribution we were going to talk about. Now, since I'm here on this page, let's look at the device identity verification and enforcement, DIVE. This is one of our new features, very nice, especially if you're trying to implement ZTNA or Zero Trust Network in your environment. The default mode is off, as you can see. Again, if you want to change any of the values, we can click on edit to change that. Now, as Rohit explained, we have three options: off, learn and enforce, and enforce. Again, since our focus on this webinar is ZTNA, I'm not going to really talk about off and learn and enforce. I'm just going to talk about enforce. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to include two links in a few minutes in the Q&A box that we do have short videos, instructions on each of these settings. Again, about 3 to 4 minutes of videos, pretty quick. If you like to learn about the two options, off and learn and enforce, I highly recommend you watch those two videos. So what happens if I change to enforce right now? Again, as I explained, if I create a user, just send the username and temporary password to users. Users can either log into the portal, download their profiles, and then first time when they log in, they get their device profile, basically, or device information provisioned automatically into the system. But once I change this to enforce, then I, as an admin, I have to add that device under the users, because otherwise users won't be able to log in. Now, once you select the enforce, there are a couple of things that we need to make a note here. As you can see, there is a minimum version of clients needed on the users' machines or computers. So if the clients is up to date, then you don't have to worry about it. But we need to make sure the minimum version of the clients is met. Now, one of the nice thing here is going to tell me right now that I already have two devices that they don't have UUID. So it means that I already have two users that they don't have the UUID defined. So if those users that try to log in after I enable this mode, they won't be able to log in unless if I go and add the UUID to their account. So we're going to see that in a second. So that's basically it about the device identity and verification. I'm going to enforce this right now here because I want to show you the user experience and what happens when we do that. So I'm going to confirm this. So my device identity verification and enforcement is set to enforce. So right now, if my users try to log in, if we don't have those information or those devices provisioned for them, they won't be able to log in. So this UUID has to match the device that they're logging in from. Now, as you can see, for example, Braden here, I already have the UUID set up here. So he will be able to log in from this client, the machine that has the same UUID. But if I look at Aiden here, this is a user I created, but we don't have any device here. So if Aiden tries to log in right now, he won't be able to log in because we don't have the device. So what I have to do as an admin, I need to go create this device profile for Aiden. Now, I can do it from here, click on the plus sign, or I can go to devices and add it from here and then enter the information. Either way, it's going to do the same thing. So let's go ahead and create the device. I'm going to give it a name, for example, Aiden _ device, and then, oops, let me fix this. And then I need to get the UUID. In order to get to the UUID, There are two ways to do it. If you already have the client app installed, you can just click on the menu bar, go to settings, and you can see the client ID here. Now, if you don't have the clients installed, every operating system has a way to do it. For example, for Windows, which the machine that I'm working on, there's a command that you can type in the command prompt and hit it, and it's going to show you the UUID. So either way, you're going to get the same number as you can see here. So this is the number that I need to add under Aidan's profile, so he can connect from this machine basically. So let's go ahead and add that UUID here. There's no description here right now. I'm just going to click on create. So as you can see, the device provisioned here, we don't have any information about the operating system or anything like that. But the very first time when Aidan logs in, we're going to see some of the information populates here as far as the operating system and regions and so on. So let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to bring up my Connect app. I already have a Connect app. Oh, before I go any further, let me show you the user experience if they don't have the Connect app and they want to log in and download the Connect app. So this is the link that is for the portal, and you can send this to the user with the username and password. I'm just going to open the browser here and go to this page. Let's say Aidan, and I'm going to type his password. Now, if the password wasn't set and he had a temporary password, here it would have asked him to create a password for him. And as you can see, once he logs into the portal, there is an instructions on how to download and install the Connect app for himself based on the operating system he has. So this is another way of basically giving instructions to the users how to download the Connect app. Now, if the devices were set, or device identity and verification was set to learn and enforce, then Aidan had an option of adding any device here himself, or if he was logging in, it would have populated automatically. But since we set up Dive to enforce, this option is grayed out and he won't be able to do it. So basically all he can do here is just download the app. So this is the user experience when they log into the portal, when we have Dive set to the most restrictive setting, which is enforce. So let's get out of here. We're going to go ahead and log in with Aidan's account. Basically, let me type I'm going to add the profile to the Connect app. It's going to ask me, oops, I was signed in as somebody else. So let me go ahead, log in as Aidan and click on sign in. The first time when you log in, it's going to ask you to select the region that the user is. Let's say Aidan is in Chicago. So we're going to choose that. This is the profile. We're going to connect. So again, we enter the UUID of this machine. We should expect to get connected with no problem here. This is going to take a second to connect. Once it's connected, there are some other information is going to populate here under devices in the admin UI. Again, as I said, such as the operating system and the region and so on. For some reason, this is taking a little bit of not responding. Obviously, that's Murphy's Law. When we do a demo, something like this happen. I don't have too many windows open, but let's close it and I'm going to open it again. Let's try it again. For some reason, I didn't connect properly. So the view profile is here. Let's see. Here we go. We're connected. So as you can see, we're connected. You can see the information for the WPC. And now if I disconnect here and go back to devices, for example, here, let's look at the Aidan's device. You can see the operating system is populated here. And if there was any other descriptions, such as like some other these accounts, it would have populated here as well. So this was expected because we already put this UUID in the machine. But let's say a bad actor got a hold of Aidan's username and password and tried to log in on his behalf from another computer. Now, that's why we use the DIVE or device identity verification. We set it to enforce to be the most restrictive one. I'm going to connect to another laptop. This is another laptop. As you can see, the Connect app here. And if I look at the UUID, this is different than the one that we provisioned for Aiden's account. So realistically, Aiden shouldn't be able to log in from this computer. So again, this is in situation that if the user tried to connect from a different device for some reason, or their login information is compromised and somebody else is trying to log in on their behalf. So let's see what's the user experience if they try to log in from a different computer. So again, it's going to come back and it's going to ask for username. I'm going to type Aiden and then password, and let's see what happens here. And as you can see here, we're not able to log in because we're using an untrusted device. So this is basically tells the user that, hey, you can log in from this machine. You need to use the machine that you're authorized to log in from. Again, this is a nice feature, especially if you're trying to use ZTNA. So let's go back to the admin portal again. I highly recommend you look at the other two options of the videos that I'm going to send you the link, but this is a nice feature to enable, especially if you're trying to set up some kind of zero trust network or implement zero trust network in your environment. Now, the last thing that Rohit kind of talk about briefly about access groups or access policy. This is how you give certain access to user groups or permissions to user groups. So if you look at the access and you expand it, you're going to get to groups. As you can see, I already have some groups here, but if you need to create one, you just click on create access group, you give a name, and then here you can choose what user groups or network or host from the source have access to what resources basically on your environment. Now, I have a couple of them already set up here, so I'll show you this. For example, on the accounting, if I look at this, my accounting group, the user groups of accounting, they only have access to our accounting server on their OVNet networks, nothing else. And there are other groups, for example, sales, or I have sales here that they only have access to, for example, or our DB team here says to Salesforce, nothing else. So this is how you can set up or distinguish basically permissions or access based on the user groups, or even if you want to do it based on the networks, if you have multiple networks added to your WPC. So basically, this was an overview of what the 3 or 4 steps that Rohit just explained. Very quickly, we talk about the DIVE and how you can implement DIVE, and we look at the user experience. As I said, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to add 3 links in the Q&A box for you guys if you like to learn a little bit more about this feature. Or the other 2 options that we didn't talk about. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to turn it back to Rohit so he can finish the presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sean. We are almost on time, just a minute left. I had a slide to wrap this up, but I can just conclude this webinar, hoping that it was useful to all, and hopefully you will do the courtesy of giving us feedback on it. And I have got a lot of questions about features, and luckily all the features and enhancements folks are mentioning, you can see in the Answered tab, all of it is on our roadmap. So we are working on it, and it's glad to see that we are working on the right things. With that, I think I'll conclude this webinar. Some of the questions asked are a bit hard to understand, right, just from that question. And those folks, please feel free to contact our support either by email, or you can log into our portal and put in a support ticket, and they'll be sure to help you out. All right, there's one question that came in. So yeah, I'm still not with you, Ivan. I'm reading your question. Best is, yeah, just check with support. Thank you very much. All right, all of you have a great day. Bye.